The first thing I remember my mother ever saying about me, not to me, but about me, the way you talk about furniture or weather, was at my cousin's graduation party when I was 12 years old. She was standing near the kitchen island, with two of her friends, holding a glass of white wine, and I was walking past with a tray of appetizers I'd spent an hour arranging because she'd asked me to help. One of her friends pointed at me and said, "Oh, is that your daughter? She's so helpful." And my mother smiled and said, "Yes, that one is very helpful. Not smart, not talented, not ambitious, helpful, the way you'd describe a good set of kitchen knives." I kept walking with the tray. I didn't stop. I told myself it didn't mean anything. I was 12. I had time to prove her wrong. I had no idea that 17 years later, I would still be carrying trays at my family's events, still being described as helpful, still waiting for someone in that house to look at me like I was something more than a useful object they kept around. My name is Maya. I'm 29 years old. For the past 4 years, I have been the co-founder and CTO of a software company called Lumen Analytics, which builds AI-powered financial forecasting tools for mid-size businesses. We have 31 employees, offices in Austin and Denver, and as of 8 months ago, a partnership contract with one of the largest regional banking networks in the Southwest worth $3.8 million. I am telling you this not to brag. I am telling you this because for most of my adult life, my own family had absolutely no idea any of it existed. That is not entirely my fault. My brother's name is Daniel. He is 34 years old and he has always been, in my parents' eyes, the one who was going somewhere. He went to the same state university I did, but his acceptance letter was framed. Mine sat on the kitchen counter for 2 weeks before someone used it to write a grocery list on the back. He studied business. I studied computer science. He graduated with a 2.9 gigapascals and immediately started working at my father's commercial real estate firm, Callaway Properties. I graduated with honors and took a junior developer job at a fintech startup in Austin, a 4-hour drive from home. The distance was, in retrospect, the best decision I ever made. My parents are not evil people. I want to be careful about that. They are the kind of parents who would do anything for their children, or rather, for the child they had decided was worth doing things for. My father worked his entire life building Callaway Properties from a 2-person operation into a firm that managed dozens of commercial properties across 3 states. He is proud of that. He wanted Daniel to inherit it, expand it, carry the name forward. And so everything in our family was organized around that goal. Daniel's career, Daniel's connections, Daniel's future. I was the other one, the helpful one, the one who drove home for holidays and made sure the cheese board looked nice, and answered the door when guests arrived so my mother didn't have to get up. I stopped telling my parents about my work early on, and not because I was ashamed of it. The first time I mentioned I was learning to build machine learning models, my mother asked if that was like a hobby. The second time I mentioned I was being promoted to lead developer, my father asked if that meant I got a raise, and then immediately pivoted to asking if Daniel had talked to me about coming back home to help at the firm. The third time, when my co-founder Rachel and I were 6 months into building Lumen, I made the mistake of mentioning it at Thanksgiving dinner. My brother looked up from his plate and said, "An analytics startup? In Austin? Maya, do you know how many of those fail in the first year?" My mother nodded like he'd said something wise. My father said nothing. I looked at my plate and changed the subject. After that, I stopped mentioning it at all. I told myself it was easier that way. I didn't need their input. I didn't need their approval. Rachel and I were working 18-hour days, building something real, something that worked, and the last thing I needed was my brother's skepticism echoing in my head at 2 a.m. when I was debugging code. So I kept the two worlds completely separate. At home, I was Maya, who drove 4 hours for Christmas, and helped with the dishes and listened to stories about Daniel's latest deal. In Austin, I was Maya Callaway, CTO, the one who had spent 3 years turning a prototype into a product that banks were starting to pay serious attention to. The separation worked, until my brother figured out how to weaponize it. It started with what I thought was a genuine change. About 10 months ago, Daniel called me out of nowhere on a Tuesday night. He said he'd been thinking about diversifying the firm's investments. He said he'd heard from someone that analytics software was a growing sector. He said, and I remember this exactly because I saved the voicemail, "I think I might have underestimated you, Maya. I'd love to hear about what you're building." I should have trusted my gut. My gut said something was wrong. My gut said Daniel had never called me on a Tuesday night in his life unless he needed something. But there is a particular kind of hunger that lives in you when you have spent your whole life wanting one person to take you seriously. And when that person finally reaches out a hand, you reach back before you think about it. He is my brother. I wanted it to be real. Over the next 6 weeks, I made the worst mistake of my professional career. I told Daniel everything. I told him about Lumen's architecture. I told him about our client pipeline. I told him about Northbridge Financial Group, the regional banking network we had been courting for almost a year, whose partnership would be the largest contract in Lumen's history if we landed it. I told him about our pricing model, our implementation timeline, our competitive advantages over the 2 other vendors Northbridge was also evaluating. I told him because he asked smart questions and seemed genuinely interested, and because I was so relieved to finally have a family member who wanted to understand what I'd built, that I stopped being careful. In December, 3 weeks before our final presentation to Northbridge's board, I got a call from a contact at Northbridge, who I'd grown close to over the months of negotiations. Her name was Patricia, and she was cautious in the way she said it, but she was clear. She told me that one of the other vendors, a company called Vertax Analytics based in Dallas, had submitted a revised proposal that morning. The proposal contained pricing structures and implementation timelines that were nearly identical to Lumen's. It contained specific language about our differentiation strategy that I had never put in writing anywhere publicly. It contained information that, as far as I knew, existed only in internal Lumen documents and in the conversations I had been having with my brother. I sat very still for a long time after that call. Then I pulled up every text message and email between Daniel and me over the past 2 months. I went back through our phone calls, which I had started recording after the 3rd one because I wanted to remember the technical questions he asked so I could explain things more clearly. I am a developer. I record things. I document things. It is habit. It saved me. Going back through those recordings, I found 3 calls where Daniel had steered the conversation specifically toward our Northbridge strategy. I found one text exchange where he had asked me, with what I now recognized as practiced casualness, about our pricing, flexibility, and whether we had a floor. I found a call where he had asked about the one technical weakness in our integration model, the thing I was most worried about under the guise of wanting to understand the challenges. I also found, through a friend who did consulting work in Dallas, that Vertax Analytics had been engaged the previous year to do a competitive market study for Callaway Properties, my father's firm, the firm where my brother worked. I did not call Daniel. I did not call my parents. I did not call a lawyer that night, though I did call one the next morning. My lawyer, whose name is Sandra and who is excellent, reviewed the recordings and the documentation and told me that what Daniel had done almost certainly constituted misappropriation of trade secrets, and that I had grounds to pursue legal action. I asked her what pursuing legal action would look like in terms of timeline and exposure heading into our Northbridge presentation. She told me it would be messy and public, and would likely delay everything for months. I told her I needed to think about it. Here is what I decided. I would not go to court, not yet. Not because I was afraid, and not because I was forgiving him, but because I had spent 4 years building Lumen and the Northbridge contract was the thing that would take us to the next level, and I was not going to let Daniel's betrayal derail the presentation I had worked a year to earn. I told Sandra to preserve everything and prepare the documentation. I told her we would circle back after Northbridge. Then I did what any good engineer does when a system has been compromised. I changed the architecture. Rachel and I spent the next 2.5 weeks reworking our Northbridge proposal from the ground up. We shifted our pricing model. We rebuilt the implementation timeline. We added a new integration layer we had been prototyping that addressed the exact technical weakness Daniel had asked me about, the one I suspected he had passed to Vertax so they could exploit it. By the time we were done, our new proposal was stronger than anything we had presented before. Vertax would walk into that boardroom with a strategy built around exploiting a vulnerability that no longer existed. The Northbridge presentation was on a Thursday in January. It was held at their headquarters in San Antonio. Rachel and I drove down the night before and stayed at a hotel near the river. We had dinner and went over our slides one more time, and then I sat by the window looking at the city lights and thought about the 12-year-old girl carrying a tray of appetizers and being described as helpful, and I thought, not today. Northbridge's board of directors had 8 members. Their CEO, a man named Richard Harmon, who had spent 30 years in regional banking and had a reputation for being direct to the point of uncomfortable, sat at the head of the table. He asked questions throughout the presentation, not the polite kind, the real kind, the kind designed to find the weak spots. I had an answer for every single one. Afterward, he asked us to step out, while the board deliberated. Rachel and I stood in the hallway, and she held my hand and neither of us said anything. 40 minutes later, Patricia came to get us. Richard Harmon stood up when we walked back in the room, which I later learned he almost never does, and he said, "Miss Calloway, we've had a lot of vendors in this room over the years. Your team built something genuinely different. We'd like to move forward." We shook hands. The contract, when it was finalized 6 weeks later, came to $3.8 million. I did not tell my family, not immediately. I needed time to figure out how to handle what came next, and what came next was complicated. What came next was my mother calling in early February to remind me that my parents were hosting a dinner party for my father's 65th birthday in March, and that it would mean a lot to have me there since, as she put it, Daniel will be bringing some very important people from the firm and it would be nice if the whole family was together. She did not mention that she expected me to help set up and serve. She didn't have to mention it. It was understood. It was always understood. I said I would be there. I did not tell her that I had also, through a mutual contact in Austin, arranged for Richard Harmon and his wife to attend. Richard had been invited separately. Through my father's business network, he had apparently done some banking work with a firm connected to Calloway Properties, which is how I'd learned he would be in Dallas that weekend, and could potentially be in San Antonio for a short visit. I made sure the connection happened. I made sure Richard knew he was welcome at a small dinner gathering. I want to be honest. I arranged this deliberately. I had been carrying evidence of my brother's betrayal for 2 months. I had a lawyer and a paper trail, and more than enough to pursue formal action. But I also knew my family. I knew that no amount of documentation would make them believe me over Daniel unless they saw something with their own eyes. I am not proud of using Richard this way. He was gracious enough to agree to stop by briefly, and I had told him only that my family were significant commercial real estate investors who I thought would enjoy meeting him. That was true. It was also not the whole picture. I am telling you this because I promised myself I would be honest about all of it, not just the parts that make me look good. The birthday dinner was on a Saturday. I drove up from Austin in the morning, arriving at my parents' house at noon, 3 hours before guests were expected. My mother had a list waiting for me on the kitchen counter. Arrange the charcuterie boards. Coordinate with the caterer on timing. Make sure the dining table centerpieces were positioned correctly. I put my bag down and I did the list, not because I had to, because I had decided that this would be the last time, and I wanted to see it clearly. My brother arrived at 2 with his girlfriend and 2 colleagues from the firm. He hugged me at the door the way he always did, that half hug with the shoulder pat, and he said, "Maya, you look great, the table looks amazing." And I looked at him and I thought, you sold me out to a competitor in Dallas to make yourself look good to Dad, and you don't even know I know. I smiled and said, "Thanks. It's good to see you." He had no idea. By 4 o'clock the dinner was in full swing. My father was in his element, holding court near the fireplace with a group of his business contacts, telling the story of how he had closed a particular office park deal in 1998 for the 15th time. Daniel was nearby, laughing at the right moments, filling people's glasses, playing the role of the heir apparent with the ease of someone who had been rehearsing it his whole life. My mother floated through the room and occasionally glanced toward the kitchen to make sure things were coming out on time. I was in the kitchen. Richard Harmon arrived at 5:15 with his wife. My father greeted him warmly. They had met twice before at industry events, enough to be on friendly terms. My mother straightened when she saw him, the way she always did around people with obvious money, that subtle recalibration. I came out of the kitchen and crossed the room. "Richard," I said, "I'm so glad you could make it." He turned, and his face did the thing I had hoped it would do. Genuine recognition, genuine warmth. He took my hand with both of his and said, "Maya, congratulations are still in order. 3 months in, and your team is already over-delivering." Northbridge couldn't be happier. The room did not go silent all at once. It was more like a slow ripple. A few people nearby stopped their conversations. My father turned. My mother turned. Daniel, standing 6 feet away, turned with a glass of wine halfway to his mouth. My father said, "I'm sorry you two know each other." Richard smiled the way people smile when they assume everyone in the room is on the same page. "Of course." Maya's company handles our analytics infrastructure. Lumen Analytics. We signed the partnership earlier this year. He paused, reading something in my father's face. You must be very proud. What her team built is genuinely impressive. We evaluated 4 vendors and it wasn't close. My father looked at me. My mother looked at me. I watched my brother's expression move through several emotions in quick succession before settling on something carefully neutral. My father said slowly, Lumen Analytics. $3.8 million contract, Richard said helpfully. Though honestly, I expect that number grows significantly as we expand the integration. Maya, you should tell your father about the Denver expansion. He looked at my father. She's been modest. Too modest, in my opinion. I stood in my parents' living room in front of 40 people and I looked at my father's face, which had gone through surprised and confused, and was now sitting somewhere between something I could only describe as recalculation. My mother had a fixed smile that wasn't quite reaching her eyes. My brother had set his wine glass down. I wasn't sure it would work out, I said, looking at my father. I didn't want to talk about it until it was real. What I did not say, standing there in that room, I know what Daniel did. I have the recordings. I have the documentation. Sandra has it all prepared. I did not say that. Not then. Not in front of 40 people at my father's birthday dinner, because humiliating my parents was not the goal. Humiliating Daniel was not the goal. The goal, if I am being precise, was simpler and older than any of that. I just wanted them to see me. Once. Clearly. Without the filter of Daniel's shadow, or my mother's ideas about what I was useful for. I think, standing there watching my father's face, I got that. Richard and his wife stayed for another 45 minutes, and in that time I watched my mother introduce me to 3 different guests as her daughter who ran a tech company. Not helpful. Not the one who's good in the kitchen. Her daughter who ran a tech company. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. After dinner, after the guests had gone, Daniel found me in the kitchen where I was wrapping up the leftover cheese. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and then he said, I didn't know the Northbridge deal closed. I turned and looked at him. It did. Maya. Don't, I said. I wasn't cold about it. I wasn't angry. Exactly. I was just done. I know what you did, Daniel. I have the recordings of every conversation. My lawyer has everything documented. I haven't decided yet what to do with it, but I know. I watched his face go pale. Tonight wasn't about that. Tonight was about Dad's birthday. I picked up the cheese tray. Happy birthday to Dad. I walked past him, and he didn't say anything else. My parents and I talked the following morning before I drove back to Austin. My father asked me why I hadn't told them about Lumen sooner. I told him the truth. Every time I tried, no one was interested. I watched him process that. He is not a man who apologizes easily, and he didn't apologize then, not in words, but he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, and he asked me to explain what Lumen did. Not in a polite, half-listening way. He leaned forward and he asked real questions. I sat across from him for an hour and I explained it, and he listened, and at the end he said, I didn't see it, I should have. That was enough. Not everything, but enough. The legal question with Daniel was harder. Rachel pushed for immediate action. Sandra laid out our options clearly. We could pursue civil litigation for trade secret misappropriation, which would likely result in a settlement and significant damages given the documentation we had. We could also report Vertax Analytics to the relevant authorities, as the case involved potential corporate espionage from their end as well. In the end, after several weeks of consideration, I chose a middle path. I had Sandra send a formal demand letter to Daniel personally, not to Callaway Properties, not to my parents, but to Daniel, outlining the full scope of what we had documented and the potential consequences of any further action against Lumen or its clients. Daniel, through his own lawyer, acknowledged receipt and signed an agreement barring any future disclosure of Lumen's proprietary information. My father found out about the letter eventually. That conversation was not easy. I do not think he will ever fully forgive Daniel, or himself, for what happened for the environment he created, where his son thought competitive advantage was worth more than his sister's livelihood. I can't fix that. It's not mine to fix. What I can tell you is that Lumen Analytics today employs 31 people, 7 of whom are women engineers we recruited specifically through university outreach programs Rachel and I run together. The Northbridge integration is expanding to 4 additional markets this year. We are in early conversations with two national financial institutions. Last month, I spoke at a tech conference in Austin to 200 aspiring founders, most of them women, most of them younger than me, some of them sitting in the audience the way I used to sit in rooms watching other people be celebrated, wondering when it would be their turn, wondering if they were doing enough, wondering if the people they loved most would ever look up from what they thought mattered and see them. I told them what I know to be true, which is that waiting for permission is the longest road to anywhere. Build the thing. Document everything. Trust your gut when someone close to you suddenly becomes very interested in the details of your work. And understand that the moment you have been carrying in your chest, the one where someone finally sees you the way you have always seen yourself, that moment will come. It will not arrive on anyone else's schedule. It will not look exactly the way you imagined it, but it will come. And when it does, you will not need the validation anymore, because you will have already become the person who earned it. My mother called last week to tell me she'd been telling her friends about Lumen. She described it as very successful and said she was always confident I had good instincts. I listened to her, and I said, "Thanks, Mom," and I meant it without the complicated edges I would have felt 2 years ago. She is who she is. She loves me the way she knows how to love, and that way is imperfect, and so is mine. The December snow she cannot see from her house in Texas, where Christmas will look the same as it always does. But in Austin, the city that chose me back when I needed somewhere to build, the lights are already going up along South Congress, and I drive to the office in the morning, with the window cracked, and think about the next version of what we're building, and the one after that, and the one after that. I am not the helpful one. I never was. I was just the one who needed a little more time for the right people to be in the room.